Hello, my dear patrons. DF here. Welcome to Writing Beauties, the mini-series of writing advice for you aspiring authors out there. I apologize for not doing this for a while. The holidays are the busiest time for me. The last poll for Writing Beauties was a tie, but I will be doing both topics that tied for first place. First, on the point of view, or POV, of a story, which is something I've seen a great number of young amateur writers, specifically in fanfiction, don't seem to have a grasp of. Which is unfortunate, as knowing which point of view you're writing in is a key element in creating your story. Not just deciding whose perspective you're writing from, but how you're going to present it. I once commented on a fanfic saying their POV was all over the place, and got a response saying, "I'm not familiar with this fancy terminology." Well, how are you going to write if you don't know the basic terminology? So let's start with the different types of POV. First, you gotta decide on what person to use in narration. And there are 3 different persons: the first person, the second person, and the third person. First person, in English, refers to the use of I and we when referring to yourself, or you and others. Remember your pronouns. First person singular is I, me, and my. And first person plural is we, us, and our. In narration, this first person is primarily singular, from the perspective of one person or character. We follow one character throughout the story, and it's like this character is telling the story. There are 2 ways to write in first person. The one you may most be familiar with is first person major, when we hear the story from the protagonist or a main character facing the problem. Examples would be Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series or Stephenie Meyer's The Twilight Saga. Then there's first-person minor, when you hear the story from a character who is not a protagonist, like an observer. Example, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Next, there is second person, with the second-person pronoun of you. This is the least used POV in published fiction and actually mostly used in textbooks or nonfiction. When it is used in fiction, it's in reader insert fanfiction, which, is not my favorite type of writing, to be honest, and therefore, second person is my least preferred POV. I'll read reader insert fanfic sometimes, but really good ones could be better written with original characters and in the third person, especially when the perspective is not just from one person. And third person is the use of pronouns such as he, she, it, they. Third person is most commonly used in fiction and actually difficult to pull off sometimes. This is when you have a narrator telling the story. Now there are actually 3 types of third person point of view. There's third person omniscient. Omniscient means all-knowing, so this is like God is narrating the story, going into the perspectives of all or multiple characters, describing all their thoughts and feelings, not just their actions. Third person limited is when the narrator only goes into one character's perspective. Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, for instance, is in third person, but primarily in Harry's point of view, with a couple of exceptions of a few prologue chapters in some of the books to give readers a feel of the magical world we live in. But even so, the first chapter of Book 6 is strictly from the point of view of the Muggle English Prime Minister. So sometimes third person limited can be with 2 characters, but the narrator is still not omniscient. And this leaves a little bit of surprise with the characters that you don't get to see the perspectives of. Finally, there's third-person objective. This is when the narrator does not go into the character's thoughts or feelings. Think of it like a sports commentator, just narrating action, but can't tell what the characters are thinking, just observing. Now, what writers most struggle with from time to time is deciding what point of view to write in. I'll say this up front. Unless this is an instructional book or a kid's book like Are You Feeling Happy Today? Do not use second person. Just don't. Outside of reader inserts, it has very little use in fiction. And even in reader inserts, it's not very effective in storytelling and just complicated. First person is mostly used in children's and young adult fiction, as it allows readers to follow the character. Young readers especially are more engaged when they're able to identify with the main character, who may be around their age. But not necessarily. Remember Harry Potter? We mostly heard from Harry, but it wasn't in the first person. J.K. Rowling probably did that so that she would be able to explain the magical world more. But even in non-Harry chapters, the book was mostly in third-person limited. Mainly people use first-person major, but first-person minor can be effective, say if the main character dies in the end, like in The Great Gatsby, spoiler alert. That story is told in past tense about Gatsby and his exploits, but it's told by his friend Nick Carraway, a character, but he's also a passive observer in the story. Or maybe the main character's voice is not as followable. The reason we hear from Dr. Watson rather than Sherlock Holmes is because this is a mystery, and Watson, like us, doesn't know the solution. In contrast, Sherlock is so smart he figures the solution out much sooner. It builds suspense, so when we hear the solution, it's told in dialogue from Sherlock. Also, I think we're a little bit more relatable to Watson than we are Sherlock, who just knows everything. For me, to choose a point of view, think for a second. Are we following one character, or are we following multiple characters? If multiple, third-person omniscient is most appropriate. If just one, either use first-person or third-person limited. If you just want to tell the story's actions, third-person objective. One common mistake I see in fanfics is switching the point of view while still using first-person. This is highly discouraged because if one person is I and another is I, it's going to confuse the reader as to who is speaking. Just do third person for the whole story if that's what you're going to do, and don't switch between first and third person. Choose one point of view and stick with it. That said, there are certain cases where switching point of view is allowable when done appropriately and effectively. If the book is written as a collection of journal entries and newspaper articles like Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course you'll be switching point of view depending on whose journal it is. As long as the section or chapter headings indicate the speaker to avoid confusion, such as Mina's journal, or in the case of From the London Times, that would be in third-person objective. Or sometimes you can have more than one narrator, but you have to be careful with that. Like one of my favorite books, The Wanderer by Sharon Creech, shows entries from protagonist Sophie and her cousin Cody. But each chapter has the speaker's name in the heading, so it's first-person major as well as minor. And because these are two different narrators, their voices are different. Even in classic literature like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, you can have a framed narrative structure, a story within a story. Frankenstein starts with one character and then another character telling the first a story. But still, the speaker is indicated either in the heading or in the prior chapter. This is my story, for example, and then the next chapter starts in first person, and by then you know it's Dr. Frankenstein telling the story. But stopping in the middle of chapters with a heading that says Person A's POV and then a paragraph or two later with Person B's POV, all of it in first person, that's just sloppy writing, and your reader's gonna have a headache. Trust me. Unless these different narratives are separated by chapters, and it's consistent, and you might not want to do it with every single character, you might as well just do third-person omniscient. No headings or changes in who is the I. It's an easy fix. Problem solved. If you're still not sure which POV to use, try writing some experimental passages from different POVs. The novel I'm currently working on, I started writing in third person, and then I realized I was spending most of my time with my amnesiac protagonist, so I rewrote the beginning in first person. And I had the readers follow along with the character, and learn about the world as the character is learning about the world. But remember, if you're writing from only one perspective, that one person is not going to know what other characters are thinking, unless they're psychic, so keep that in mind when writing. Only show one person's thoughts and feelings. So, to recap, decide how many perspectives you want to focus on, choose one point of view, either first person or third, and stick to it. And decide how all-knowing you want your narrator to be. If you want to know more about writing point of view, look up the titles I just mentioned, or look at your favorite books and see what point of view those authors are writing in and how they're handled. Until next time, I, the first person narrator, am out of here.